The Nigerian Civil War, the 6th of July 1967 to the 15th of January 1970, also known as the Nigerian-Biafran War or the Biafran War, was a civil war fought between the government of Nigeria and the Republic of Biafra, a secessionist state which had declared its independence from Nigeria in 1967. The Republic of Biafra, a separatist state that had proclaimed its independence from Nigeria in 1967, and the Nigerian government fought each other in the Nigerian Civil War, which lasted from the 6th of July 1967 to the 15th of January 1970. General Yakubu Gowon headed Nigeria, while Lieutenant Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu headed Biafra. The Igbo ethnic group's leadership believed they could no longer cohabit with the federal government, which was dominated by the interests of the Muslim Hausa-Fulanis of northern Nigeria, and Biafra represented their nationalist aspirations. Before Britain formally decolonized Nigeria from 1960 to 1963, there were political, economic, ethnic, cultural, and religious conflicts that led to the struggle. In 1966, ethnic and religious strife, anti-Igbo pogroms in northern Nigeria, a military coup, a counter-coup, and the persecution of Igbo living there were some of the immediate causes of the conflict. A crucial strategic role was also played by control of the highly profitable oil output in the Niger Delta. Within a year, troops from the federal government had surrounded Biafra, taken control of the city of Port Harcourt, and captured coastal oil infrastructure. During the ensuing standoff, which resulted in widespread hunger, a blockade was imposed as a deliberate strategy. About 100,000 soldiers were killed in the war's 2.5 years of fighting, but between 500,000 and 2 million Biafran people perished from famine. Midway through 1968, pictures of famished and undernourished Biafran youngsters flooded the media in Western nations. As a result of the starving Biafrans' situation becoming a global cause célèbre, international non-governmental groups have seen a huge increase in funding and recognition, NGOs. The Nigerian government was primarily supported by the UK and the USSR, while Biafra was backed by France, Israel, after 1968, and a few other nations. The official stance of the United States was one of neutrality, viewing Nigeria as a responsibility of Britain, but some see the country's decision to not recognize Biafra as showing support for the Nigerian leadership. Due to the near proximity of these protectorates, the colonial amalgamation of the Northern Protectorate, Lagos Colony, and Southern Nigeria Protectorate, later renamed Eastern Nigeria, in 1914 was designed to improve administration. The alteration, however, did not account for the variations in the cultures and beliefs of the inhabitants of each region. Tensions were made worse by rivalry for political and economic dominance. With a population of 45.2 million people and more than 300 different ethnic and cultural groupings, Nigeria obtained independence from the United Kingdom on 1 October 1960. The Igbo, who made up between 60 and 70% of the population in the southeast, the Hausa-Fulani of the Sokoto Caliphate, who made up about 67% of the population in the northern part of the territory, and the Yoruba, who made up about 75% of the population in the southwest, were the three largest ethnic groups in colonial Nigeria. Although each of these ethnic groups has its own homeland, by the 1960s all three were widely scattered throughout Nigeria, with a sizable presence in the country's major cities. In 1967, there were still 5,000 Igbo people living in Lagos. The Hausa-Fulani, a semi-feudal Muslim people in the north, were formerly governed by an emiri hierarchy that descended from a supreme sultan. The emirs were part of a conservative Islamic hierarchy. It was believed that this sultan was the fount of all governmental and religious authority. Similar to the Hausa-Fulani, the Yoruba political structure in the southwest was composed of a succession of monarchs known as Obas. However, In contrast to their northern counterparts, Yoruba rulers lacked autocracy. Since money and status were acquired rather than inherited, the Yoruba political and social structure promoted more upward mobility. While there were heirs or rulers in many of the ancient towns, such the Kingdom of Nri, the Igbos and the ethnic tribes of the Niger Delta in the southeast generally lived in independent, democratically organized communities. At its height, the kingdom ruled over the majority of Igbo territory, exerting power over the Anioma people, Arachukwu, which oversaw Igbo enslavement, and the Onitsha region. In contrast to the other two regions, men and women participated in the General Assembly that made decisions within the Igbo communities. Divergent political structures and systems reflect and give rise to different traditions and values. The Hausa-Fulani commoners did not see political leaders as susceptible to persuasion because they only had contact with the political system through a village head chosen by the emir or one of his deputies. Political choices have to be made in submission. Leadership posts were awarded to individuals who were prepared to submit to and show loyalty to superiors, as was the case with many other authoritarian religious and political regimes. Maintaining traditional values was one of this governmental system's primary functions, which led many Hausa-Fulani to see economic and social innovation as subversive or sacrilegious. The Igbos and other Biafrans frequently participated directly in the choices that touched their life, in contrast to the Hausa-Fulani. They had a keen understanding of politics and saw it as a tool for accomplishing their own objectives. Status was gained by being able to settle disagreements that might occur in the village and by making riches rather than inheriting it. 57. The Igbo had suffered significantly as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. In 1790, it was believed that 16,000 of the 20,000 individuals sold from Bonny each year were Igbo. The Igbo people successfully adapted to and opposed colonial control because they placed a high value on social achievement and political engagement. The Nigerian colonial administration preserved and perhaps even strengthened these traditions-based disparities. The colonial authority in the north found it simpler to rule covertly through the emirs, preserving rather than altering the native people's authoritarian political structure. Due to the exclusion of Christian missionaries, the region remained mostly unaffected by European cultural influences. In contrast, the wealthiest Igbo frequently sent their kids to British institutions in an effort to prepare them for employment with the British. The northern emirs strengthened their social structure while preserving their ancient political and religious institutions during the next years. The north of Nigeria was by far the least developed region when it gained independence in 1960. It had a 2% literacy rate in English compared to 19.2% in the east, but literacy in Ajami, local languages written in Arabic, which was taught as part of religious education, was substantially higher. Due to its early exposure to Western education and the establishment of a free primary education program by the Western regional government prior to independence, the West also possessed a significantly higher level of literacy. The missionaries quickly brought Western educational methods to the West. The Yoruba were the first ethnic group in Nigeria to embrace Western bureaucratic social norms as a result. They comprised the first generations of African scientists, engineers, physicians, judges, and other professions. Because the British had trouble establishing solid authority over the highly autonomous populations, missionaries were eventually introduced in eastern regions. The Igbo and other Biafran people, on the other hand, aggressively embraced Western education and largely converted to Christianity. Thousands of Igbos left the Igbo homeland in pursuit of employment due to population pressure and aspirations for monetary remuneration. By the 1960s, tradesmen and literate elites were active throughout Nigeria, not just in the historically Igbo East, and Igbo political culture had become more cohesive. By 1966, New divisions in economic class and ethnicity had worsened the long-standing racial and religious divides between Northerners and Igbo. The colonial administration split Nigeria into the North, West, and East regions, which widened the already pronounced economic, political, and social divides between Nigeria's various ethnic groups. The North had a marginally larger population than the other two areas put together due to the way the country was partitioned. During Nigeria's first census, there were several claims of fraud, and the country's population still dominates political discourse in Nigeria. On the basis of this, the colonial authorities distributed the bulk of the seats in the federal legislature to the northern region. The Northern People's Congress, NPC, in the north, the Action Group, AG, in the west, and the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, in the east were political parties that were largely regional and based on ethnic allegiances. The three regions' dominant ethnic groups were Hausa-Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo. The fact that these groups were generally based in one region and one tribe contributed significantly to Nigeria's disintegration, despite the fact that they were not entirely homogeneous in terms of their ethnic or regional makeup. When Britain combined the northern and southern protectorates, the foundation of modern Nigeria was created. The British established a system of indirect authority, which they influenced through partnerships with regional forces, beginning with the Northern Protectorate. Because of how efficiently the system operated, colonial governor Frederick Lugard was successful in his efforts to have it expanded through merger to the Southern Protectorate. The Igbos were thus subjected to an alien, hierarchical form of government. Intellectuals started to push for more freedom and independence. With the huge development of the national education program in the 1950s, the population of this intellectual class rapidly rose. The Igbo and Yoruba parties were at the vanguard of the fight for freedom from British control in the 1940s and 1950s. Leaders in the north favored the continuation of British control because of concern that independence would result in the more westernized elites in the south dominating politics and the economy. They required that the nation remain split into three areas, with the north having a clear majority, as a condition of recognizing independence. Leaders of the Igbo and Yoruba accepted the demands of the north because they were determined to achieve independence at all costs. However, there were substantial cultural and ideological differences between the two southern regions, which caused strife between the two southern political groups. First, the AG supported a loose confederacy of regions where each area would have complete autonomy over its own unique territory inside the newly emerging nation of Nigeria. The status of Lagos was a source of contention for the AG, who opposed its designation as the country's capital if it would result in the loss of Yoruba sovereignty. Lagos is a Yoruba town located in western Nigeria and was at the time the federal capital and seat of the national government. The AG maintained that without any loss of identity, control, or autonomy by the Yoruba, Lagos must be fully acknowledged as a Yoruba town. In contrast to this stance, the NCNC was eager to label Lagos as no man's land, because it was the federal capital territory. This declaration infuriated the AG, who offered to help fund the establishment of another region in Nigeria as the federal capital territory, and then threatened secession from Nigeria if it didn't get its way. In numerous constitutional conferences, including the one held in London in 1954, the AG's threat of secession was presented, documented, and noted with the demand that a right of secession be enshrined in the constitution of the emerging Nigerian nation to permit any part of the emerging nation to opt out of Nigeria, should the need arise. The NCNC aggressively pushed for a tightly tied united, unitary structured nation and opposed the AG's proposal to include a right of secession by the regions in independent Nigeria because it saw the insertion of a secession clause as harmful to the development of a unitary Nigerian state. The AG was compelled to renounce its position on including the right of secession as a part of the Nigerian constitution in the face of persistent opposition from the NCNC delegates, who were later joined by the NPC and supported by threats from the British to view maintenance of the inclusion of secession by the AG as treason. The subsequent circumstances that led to the Nigerian-Biafran Civil War might have been prevented if such a clause had been included in the Nigerian constitution. The NCNC, pre-independence NPC's alliance against the AG's objectives would eventually establish the standard for political control of an independent Nigeria and result in tragedy for Nigeria. The Jos riot in 1945, which resulted in the deaths of 300 Igbo people, and fighting in Kano, Nigeria, on May 1, 1953, were the first manifestations of northern-southern animosity. Political parties frequently concentrated on gaining influence in their home regions, which led to an uncoordinated and divided federal administration. The subsequent circumstances that led to the Nigerian-Biafran Civil War might have been prevented if such a clause had been included in the Nigerian constitution. The NCNC, pre-independence NPC's alliance against the AG's objectives would eventually establish the standard for political control of an independent Nigeria and result in tragedy for Nigeria. The Jos riot in 1945, which resulted in the deaths of 300 Igbo people, and fighting in Kano, Nigeria, on May 1, 1953, were the first manifestations of northern-southern animosity. Political parties frequently concentrated on gaining influence in their home regions, which led to an uncoordinated and divided federal administration. The southern region was split into the western region and the eastern region by the British in 1946. Each government had the right to receive royalties from resources taken from its territory. When Shell BP discovered sizable petroleum resources in the eastern area in 1956, this situation altered. Resource royalties will now go into a distributable pools account, with the money being divided up across other departments of government, according to a commission led by Sir Jeremy Reisman and Ronald Tress, 50% to region of origin, 20% to federal government, 30% to other regions. The British government encouraged secessionist tendencies within the two southern regions in order to maintain its power. It also encouraged unity within the northern bloc. Following independence, the Nigerian government encouraged unrest in the west by establishing a new Midwestern region in an area with potential for oil. The full property in and management of all mineral oils in, under, or upon any lands in Nigeria, as well as of all rivers, streams, and watercourses throughout Nigeria, is and shall be vested in the Crown, according to the new Constitution of 1946. The post-war economic boom led to a five-fold increase in Nigerian exports, which greatly benefited Britain. The First Republic was established on 1 October 1963, 1 year after Nigeria attained independence on 1 October 1960. Northerner and co-founder of the Northern People's Congress, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa served as Nigeria's first prime minister. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the party's well-known nationalist leader who later rose to the position of president, and the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons Party joined forces under his leadership. The third major party, the Yoruba-aligned Action Group, served as the adversary. Low pay and unfavorable working conditions made workers more and more irate, especially when they contrasted their situation with the lifestyles of Lagosian officials. Most wage earners resided in the Lagos region, and many of them did so in dangerously overcrowded dwellings. In 1963, labor unrest, including strikes, increased, eventually leading to a June 1964 general strike that affected the entire country. Strikers ignored a demand to go back to work, and riot police eventually had to disperse them. They eventually succeeded in gaining pay raises. People from many ethnic groups took part in the strike. The general strike significantly increased tensions between the army and regular civilians and put pressure on the army to intervene against a government that was widely seen to be corrupt, according to a later essay by retired Brigadier General H. M. Ojukwu. The 1964 elections, which entailed intense campaigning throughout the entire year, highlighted racial and geographic tensions. Politicians were highly despised, and many campaigners were concerned for their safety as they traveled the nation. The Tiv people were agitating for self-determination when the army regularly deployed to Tiv division, killing hundreds of them and detaining thousands more. The validity of the election was compromised by widespread claims of fraud. Westerners in particular hated the Northern People's Congress's political dominance since so many of its candidates won their elections with no opposition. As the country became more violent, people started to flee to the north and west, some even making their way to Dahomey. Elements of the military were prompted to consider taking decisive action by the North's apparent dominance of the political system and the turmoil spreading across the nation. The British also profited from mining and commerce in addition to Shell BP. 41.3% of all Nigeria's exports were controlled by the British-owned United Africa Company alone. Nigeria had risen to the 10th largest oil exporter in the world with a daily output of 516,000 barrels. The Army Nigeria received its independence in 1960 was an internal security force created and trained to support the police in putting down challenges to power rather than to fight a war, despite the fact that the Nigeria Regiment had served for Britain in both the First and Second World Wars. The Nigerian Army was described by the Indian historian Pradeep Barua in 1960 as a glorified police force, and even after independence, it continued to play the same function that it had under the British in the 1950s. The Nigerian Army lacked heavy weaponry and did not perform field training. Prior to 1948, Nigerians were not permitted to hold officers' commissions, and it was only in 1948 that a select group of promising recruits from that country were permitted to attend Sandhurst for officer training. At the same time, Nigerian NCOs were permitted to advance to the rank of officer by successfully completing an officer training program at Mons Hall or Eton Hall in England. Despite the reforms, just 7 Nigerians annually from 1955 to 1960 and only 2 on average between 1948 and 1955 received officers' commissions. Only 57 of the 257 officers leading the Nigeria Regiment, which later became the Nigerian Army, at the time of independence in 1960 were natives of the country. The colonial government had decided that the martial races of northern Nigeria, such as the Hausa, Kiv, and Kanuri, were the hard, martial races, whose recruitment was encouraged, while the martial races of southern Nigeria, such as the Igbos and the Yoruba, were viewed as too soft to make for good soldiers and their recruitment was discouraged. In 1958, the rule was amended such that men from the north would no longer make up 50% of the army and that men from the southeast and southwest would each make up 25%. After independence, the new policy remained in place. The change in recruitment practices was bitterly resented by the previously favored Northerners, whose egos had been stroked by being told by their officers that they were the tough and hardy, martial races, all the more so because opportunities for Nigerian men to serve as officers that had not previously existed after independence in 1960 now existed. Because men from the southeast and southwest typically had higher levels of education than men from the north, they were considerably more likely to be promoted to officers in the newly established Nigerian Army, which further inflamed the Northerners' hatred. By promoting as many Nigerians as possible, the government sent home the British officers who had been retained after independence at the same time as part of its Nigerianization strategy, and by 1966, there were no longer any British officers. The Sandhurst graduates who served in the high command were despised by the ambitious men who made up the officer corps because they stood in their way of further opportunities for promotion. As a result of the Nigerianization policy, educational requirements for officers were drastically lowered, with only a high school diploma being required for a commission. Because they believed that the Northern Prime Minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, was robbing the southeast of its oil wealth, a group of Igbo officers plotted to topple the government. Major Emmanuel Ifeajuna, Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu, and other junior army officers, mostly majors and captains, attempted a coup d'état on January 15, 1966. Major Nzeogwu executed the two most important political figures in the north, Prime Minister Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and Premier Sir Amadu Bello. The wife of Sir Amadu Bello and officials from the north were also killed. Igbo President Sir Nnamdi Azikiwe was in the West Indies for a protracted holiday. He didn't come back for days following the coup. There was a widespread belief that he and other Igbo leaders had received information about the upcoming coup from the Igbo coup plotters. The premier of the Western region, Ladoke Akintola, and senior Yoruba military personnel were also assassinated, in addition to the northern political leaders. Some have claimed that the coup, also known as the coup of the Five Majors, was Nigeria's sole revolutionary coup. In the brief history of Nigeria's emerging second democracy, this was the country's first coup. One of the explanations offered by the coup plotters was allegations of electoral fraud. In addition to killing a significant portion of Nigeria's elite, the Majors' coup also resulted in the deaths of a significant portion of the Nigerian Federal Army's leadership, including 7 officers with ranks above colonel. 4 of the 7 deceased officers were from the north, 2 from the south, and 1 was from the Midwest. There was only 1 Igbo. Other Nigerians, particularly those in the northern and western regions and later revisionists of Nigerian coups, did not, however, view this coup as a revolutionary coup. Some people, mainly from the eastern region of Nigeria, claimed that the Majors wanted to free Action Group leader Obafemi Awolowo and install him as the new leader. Their goal was to topple the northern-dominated power system, but they were unable to seize control. Igbo and loyalist Nigerian Army Chief Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi put a stop to coup attempts in the south and was proclaimed President of State on January 16 following the Majors' capitulation. But in the end, the Majors were unable to pursue their political objective. While their coup of January 15 was successful in gaining political authority in the north, it was unsuccessful in the south, particularly in the Lagos-Ibadan-Abeokuta military district where obedient troops under the command of Army Commander Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi were able to put down the uprising. The other 2 January Majors and the remaining military officers involved in the uprising later surrendered to the Loyalist High Command and were subsequently detained as a federal investigation into the incident got underway, with the exception of Ifeajuna, who left the country after their coup failed. The constitution was suspended and the legislature was dissolved by Aguiyi-Ironsi. Having reportedly been influenced by NCNC political thought, he eliminated the regional confederated form of government and adopted unitary policies that were favored by the NCNC. To show some desire to continue working with this bloc, he did pick Colonel Hassan Katsina, the son of Katsina Emir Usman Nagogo, to lead the northern region. Additionally, he released prisoners of northern politicians with preference, enabling them to plan his forthcoming overthrow. Although Aguiyi-Ironsi declined the British offer of military assistance, he pledged to defend their interests. Ironsi made the catastrophic error of failing to prosecute the failed coup plotters as required by military law at the time and as suggested by the majority of northern and western commanders. Instead, coup plotters were kept on full pay in the military, and some even received promotions while awaiting trial. Despite its failures, Many people believed that the Igbo peoples benefited most from the coup because neither the plotters nor any important Igbo political leaders faced any consequences for their activities. The military and political leadership of the western and northern regions had been largely bloodily eliminated, whereas the eastern military and political leadership had largely escaped unharmed, despite the fact that those who carried out the coup were predominantly northern. The majority of the known plotters were Igbo. However, Ironsi, himself an Igbo, was reported to have made repeated attempts to appease northerners. Other incidents, such as the assassinations of northern leaders and the murder of Brigadier General Adamalagan's pregnant wife by the coup assassins, added fuel to the accusations of an alleged Igbo conspiracy. The ease with which Ironsi put an end to the coup raised suspicion that the Igbo coup plotters had intended all along to open the door for Ironsi to assume control of Nigeria despite the obvious contradictions of the coup being executed by mostly northern soldiers, such as John Atampere. Later military governor of Benue State. The killing of Igbo soldier Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Unegbe by coup executioners, and Ironsi's termination of an Igbo-led coup. At this point, Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu was appointed military governor of the eastern region. The military administration issued Unification Decree No. 34, which called for the federation to be replaced by a more centralized structure, on May 24, 1966. This decree was unacceptably harsh for the Northern Bloc. On the night of July 29, 1966, Northern soldiers at the Abeokuta barracks mutinied in response to provocation from the Eastern media, which frequently displayed degrading posters and cartoons of the murdered Northern officials. This sparked a counter-coup that had previously been in the works. During their revolt, Ironsi was visiting Ibadan, where he was slain, along with his host, Adekunle Fajuyi. He belonged to a minority group, was from the north, was a Christian, and was well liked by his fellow soldiers. It appears that Gowon was immediately confronted with secession threats from the northern and even the western region, in addition to a potential stalemate with the east. The conspirators of the counter-coup had thought about taking advantage of the situation to leave the federation themselves. However, ambassadors from the United States and Britain pressed Gowon to keep control over the entire nation. Following this strategy, Gowon announced the repeal of the Unification Decree and the resumption of the federal system. Pogroms in the north between June and October 1966 resulted in the deaths of between 8,000 and 30,000 Igbo, half of whom were children, and between 1 million and 2 million fleeing to the eastern region. Due to the fact that it was seen as the worst day of the atrocities, September 29, 1966, came to be known as Black Thursday. The pogroms I saw in Makurdi, Nigeria, late September 1966, were foreshadowed by months of intense anti-Igbo and anti-Eastern conversations among Tiv, Adoma, Hausa and other northerners resident in Makurdi, and, fitting a pattern replicated in city after city, the massacres were led by the Nigerian army. This is according to ethnomusicologist Charles Kyle, who was in Nigeria at the time. Colonel Gowon could be heard on the radio providing guarantees of safety to all Easterners and Nigerian residents before, during, and after the massacre. But the troops' intent, the only power that matters in Nigeria right now or then, was painfully obvious. I was led back to the city by soldiers after counting the dismembered remains along the Makurdi road. The soldiers apologized for the stink and explained gently that by eradicating Igbos, they were doing me and the rest of the world a tremendous favor. The federal military government also created the foundation for the eastern region's economic blockade, which was fully implemented in 1967. In eastern Nigeria, the influx of refugees led to a challenging scenario. Ojukwu, who represented eastern Nigeria, and Gowon, who represented the Nigerian Federal Military Administration, engaged in extensive negotiations. The parties agreed in the Aburi Accord, which was ultimately signed in Aburi, Ghana, that a looser Nigerian federation would be put into place. Gowon put off making the arrangement public before breaking it. Gowon announced the split of Nigeria into 12 states on May 27, 1967. Southeastern State, Rivers State, and East Central State are the three divisions created by this order to make up the eastern region. The majority of the petroleum, which is located in the other two regions, would now be under the jurisdiction of the Igbos, who are mainly found in the East Central State. The Republic of Biafra proclaimed its independence on May 30, 1967, through Ojukwu. An embargo was immediately imposed by the federal military government on all shipping to and from Biafra, but not on oil tankers. Biafra moved swiftly to begin collecting oil royalties from corporations operating within its borders. At the end of June, Shell BP agreed to this request, and the federal government expanded its blockade to cover oil. The blockade, which the majority of foreign actors supported, was crucial in putting Biafra at a disadvantage from the start of the conflict. The relatively young nation was resolved to protect itself despite a persistent lack of military equipment. Even though there was widespread sympathy in Europe and abroad, the new republic was only formally recognized by 5 nations: Tanzania, Gabon, Côte d'Ivoire, Zambia, and Haiti. To protect the nation it had founded, Britain provided heavy guns and ammunition to the Nigerian side. Though France's government denied supporting Biafra, the Biafra side got weapons and ammunition from France. According to a 20 November 1968 article in Paris Match, French weapons were passing through neighboring nations like Gabon to reach Biafra. The main factor in influencing how the war turned out was Britain's massive supply of armaments. There were several peace treaties, with the one in Aburi, Ghana, being the most significant, the Aburi Accord. Various accounts of what happened in Aburi exist. While the federal government accused Ojukwu of lying and making up facts, Ojukwu charged that it had broken its obligations. Ojukwu was successful in getting support for a confederation rather than a federation for Nigeria. His advisors forewarned him that Gowon did not understand the distinction and would break the pact. Ojukwu saw this as both a failure by Gowon to uphold the spirit of the Aburi Accord at the time, as well as a lack of integrity on the part of the Nigerian military government in talks to create a single Nigeria. In contrast, Gowon's advisors believed that he had carried out the spirit of Aburi as much as was politically possible. The Nigerians outnumbered and outgunned the eastern region, but they had the advantages of fighting in their own country, having the support of the majority of Easterners, being tenacious, and making the most use of their limited supplies. The Soviet Union and the UK, which still exerted the most influence over Nigeria's highly prized oil business through Shell BP, provided significant military assistance to the Nigerian government. In 1967, the Nigerian army was totally unprepared for combat. The Nigerian army was still essentially an internal security force and had any operational training or combat experience. The majority of Nigerian officers were more focused on their social life than military training, devoting an excessive amount of time to partying, intoxicating themselves, hunting, and playing video games. In the army, social standing was very important, and commanders spent an enormous amount of time making sure their uniforms were constantly spotless. There was also competition to buy the priciest cars and houses. The majority of the junior officers were significantly reliant on the more seasoned NCOs to provide the essential leadership because almost all of them had gotten their commissions after 1960. The Biafran Army, whose officer corps was composed primarily of former federal Igbo officers, was even more severely affected by the same issues that plagued the Federal Army. The Biafran Army had a severe dearth of experienced officers, which was made worse by a paranoid and suspicious atmosphere within Biafra because Ojukwu thought other former federal officers were scheming against him. Biafra approach had been successful since the East was now defending itself after the central government had begun the conflict. Colonel Muhammad Shua, who was in charge of the Nigerian Army's offensive against Biafra, organized the local military forces into the 1st Infantry Division. Northern commanders predominated as the division's leaders. The Western Nigerian column proceeded on the town of Nsukka, which fell on July 14, while the Eastern column headed for Garkum, which was taken on July 12. Both columns encountered unexpectedly intense resistance and severe casualties. The Biafrans returned the favor by going on the attack. On August 9, Biafran forces entered the mid-western state of Nigeria by crossing the Niger River and their western boundary. The Biafrans moved west, passing through Benin City, the state capital, until they were stopped on August 21 at Ore, in what is now Ondo State, 210 kilometers, 130 miles, east of Lagos, the capital of Nigeria. Lieutenant Colonel Banjo, a Yoruba with the Biafran rank of brigadier, was in charge of the Biafran assault. The Midwestern state offered no resistance to the attack, and it was quickly seized. The pre-secession agreement that all soldiers should return to their home regions in order to end the killing spree, in which Igbo soldiers had been the main victims, was the cause of this. The majority of the Nigerian soldiers sent to protect the Midwestern state were Igbo natives, and while some communicated with their Biafran counterparts, others resisted the invasion. General Gowon responded by ordering the formation of a new division, the 2nd Infantry Division, and ordering Colonel Murtala Muhammad, who would later assume the position of president in 1975, to drive out the Biafrans from the Midwestern state, protect the western state's border, and launch an attack on Biafra. Gowon proclaimed total war at the same time and said the federal government would mobilize the whole Nigerian people for the war effort. The Federal Army expanded from a force of 7,000 troops to a force of 200,000 men organized in 3 divisions between the summer of 1967 and the spring of 1969. In Enugu, Biafra started the war with only 240 men. By August 1967, that number had increased to 2 battalions, which were then extended into 2 brigades, the 51st and 52nd, which formed the nucleus of the Biafran army. At the time, the westernmost nation of Nigeria, Benin, was today still known as Dahomey. The Nigerians eventually retook Benin City on September 22, but the Biafrans had already achieved their main goal by encircling as many Nigerian federal forces as they could. General Gowon also launched an operation against Biafra from the Niger Delta to the riverine region, forming the 3rd Infantry Division with the majority of the Lagos Garrison Command led by Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, known as the Black Scorpion, which was later renamed as the 3rd Marine Commando. The Nigerian Army expanded its recruiting efforts as the conflict went on to include the Yoruba, Itsekiri, Urhobo, Edo, Ijaw, etc. 2 brigades with 3 battalions apiece made up the command. The 2nd Brigade proceeded along the axis of the Gakem-Abudu-Agoja Road, while the 1st Brigade advanced along the Ogugu-Agunga-Nsukka Road. The 1st Brigade had taken control of every territory assigned to it by July 10, 1967. The 2nd Brigade had taken Gakem, Agudu, and Agoja by July 12. Egypt dispatched 6 Ilyushin Il-28 bombers piloted by Egyptian air pilots to help Nigeria. The Egyptians' propensity to bomb Red Cross facilities alongside schools, hospitals, and marketplaces significantly increased support for Biafra on a global scale. The Nigerian government thought that once Enugu was captured, the movement for secession would come to a stop. Enugu became the center of secession and revolt. On September 12, 1967, the planning to take Enugu were initiated. The Nigerian 1st Division took Enugu on October 4. When the federal troops attacked the Biafran State House, Ojukwu was dozing off. He nearly escaped by posing as a servant. Even if Ojukwu did not follow them, many Nigerians believed Enugu's seizure would persuade the Igbo's traditional elite to renounce their support for secession. This didn't happen. Ojukwu easily moved his administration to Umuahia, a city located far inside the traditional Igbo territory. The forced movement of employees left the Ministry of Information disorganized, and the federal forces' success undercut prior Biafran claims that the Nigerian state could not endure a protracted conflict. As a result, the fall of Enugu temporarily damaged Biafran propaganda efforts. In a broadcast on October 23, the Biafran official radio stated that Ojukwu had vowed to keep opposing the federal government and had attributed the fall of Enugu on subversive activities. 700 civilians were massacred by Nigerian troops led by Murtala Muhammad when they seized Asaba on the River Niger. 3 times throughout the month of October, the Nigerians' attempts to cross the River Niger were unsuccessful, costing hundreds of soldiers, dozens of tanks, and other pieces of equipment. The Nigerian Federal Army lost nearly 5,000 soldiers during the 2nd Infantry Division's initial effort to cross the Niger on October 12 from the town of Asaba to the Biafran city of Onitsha. A military engagement between Nigerian and Biafran military troops took place during Operation Tiger Claw, the 17th to the 20th of October 1967. The Biafrans were headed by Col. Ogbu Ogi, who was in charge of overseeing the region between Calabar and Opobo, and Lynn Garrison, a European mercenary, while the Nigerians were led by Benjamin Adekunle, aka the Black Scorpion, who was in charge of invading Calabar on October 17, 1967. The sea and the air opened fire on the Biafrans right away. The Nigerian Air Force pounded Biafran stations and military supplies for the following 2 days. The moment Lynn Garrison arrived in Calabar that day, federal troops opened fire on him. On October 20, Garrison's soldiers left the field of combat and Col. Ogi gave General Adekunle his formal surrender. Port Harcourt was taken on May 19, 1968. The federal government's superiority in the war was made clear to the outside world with the conquest of Enugu, Bonny, Calabar, and Port Harcourt. Biafran propaganda consistently attributed military setbacks to saboteurs within Biafran offices, and both officers and lower ranks were urged to report potential saboteurs. As Ojukwu carried out purges and had officers who were only accused of being saboteurs dragged out and shot, Biafran officers were much more likely to be executed by their own side than by the Federal Army throughout the duration of the war. The majority of the former federal Igbo officers who had joined Biafra did not have Ojukwu's trust since he viewed him as potential rivals and engaged in ruthless purges that resulted in the execution of the majority of them. Additionally, Ojukwu required scapegoats for Biafra's setbacks because losing battles usually resulted in an officer's death. Ojukwu established a number of formations that operated outside the established line of command, such as the S Brigade, which he led, and the 4th Commando Brigade, which was led by the German mercenary Rolf Steiner. The morale of the Biafran officer corps was negatively impacted by Ojukwu's leadership, particularly his repeated killings of his own officers, according to Barua. As Barua stated, the Biafran army lacked the continuity and coherence to learn from the war, which made it difficult for the Biafran officers to get the requisite expertise to conduct military operations successfully. The Shell BP Petroleum Development Company was the first to explore for oil in Nigeria in 1937. The federal government imposed a shipping restriction on the territory in an effort to manage the oil in the eastern region. Oil tankers were not covered by this prohibition. In a letter to Shell BP, the Biafra leadership demanded royalties for the oil being explored in their area. Shell BP ultimately decided to pay Biafra the sum of £250,000 after much consideration. When the federal government learned of this payment, it promptly expanded the shipping embargo to include oil tankers. Furthermore, The Nigerian government made it clear to Shell BP that it anticipated them to pay all unpaid oil royalties right now. Due to the payment for Biafra being delayed, the government ordered Shell BP to cease activities there and took over from the firm. Bonny Island in the Niger Delta was taken over by Nigerian federal troops and Marines at the end of July 1967, seizing control of crucial Shell BP facilities. When Nigeria took Port Harcourt in May 1968, operations resumed. Its facilities required to be repaired after being damaged. Oil exports and production both continued, but at a reduced rate. Production increased at Forçados from 142,000 barrels per day in 1958 to 540,000 barrels per day in 1969 following the building of a new terminal there. This number doubled to 1.08 million barrels per day in 1970. Nigeria was able to purchase more weaponry and employ mercenaries because to the royalties. The inability of Biafra to compete on this level showed. In order to continue and increase its supply of affordable, high-quality oil from Nigeria, Britain had planned. As a result, it gave maintenance of oil extraction and refining activities top attention. The conflict started about a week before the Six-Day War in the Middle East resulted in the blockage of the Suez Canal, forcing oil tankers from the region to take the circuitous route around the Cape of Good Hope, raising the price of Middle Eastern oil. As a result, Nigerian oil became more significant to Britain since it was less expensive than oil from the Persian Gulf. In the beginning, when it wasn't clear which side would win, Britain used a wait-and-see strategy before making a firm choice for Nigeria. Nigeria possessed an air force of 76 planes, none of which were fighters or bombers, a navy of only 6 ships, the largest of which was a frigate, and an army of 7,000 soldiers without tanks and a dearth of officers with command experience. Although Biafra was also a weak nation, the two forces seemed evenly matched at the start of the conflict, and Nigeria's triumph was not viewed as a given. Britain supported the federal government but warned them not to harm British oil installations in the east when the war started. The Shell BP Petroleum Development Company, which is jointly owned by Shell and British Petroleum, was in charge of these oil works, which were responsible for 84% of Nigeria's daily production of 580,000 barrels. This oil was produced in 2 regions, the newly formed Midwest and the Eastern region, each of which contributed 1/3 of the total. In Britain, 2/5 of the oil produced in Nigeria was used. Nigeria supplied 30% of the oil imported into Britain in 1967. Therefore, Shell BP carefully weighed the federal government's request that it refuse to pay the royalties that Biafra is seeking. Its attorneys suggested that if this government would indeed uphold law and order in the relevant area, payment to Biafra would be justified. The federal government's reputation could be damaged by funding Biafra, the British government warned. After Shell BP made the payment, the government imposed an export ban on oil. When forced to pick a side, Shell BP and the British government in Lagos sided with the federal government, ostensibly believing that this side had a better chance of winning the conflict. Ojukwu, even if won, will not be in a strong position, as the British High Commissioner in Lagos wrote to the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs on July 27, 1967. He will need all the support and recognition the world has to offer. The position of the federal government would be substantially better both domestically and internationally. I'm very confident they would pursue their case to the point of revoking the corporation's concessions and nationalizing its facilities, since they would have a strong case for the worse treatment of a company that has supported a rebel. Therefore, I draw the conclusion that the corporation should quickly return to the Lagos side of the fence with a checkbook in hand if it changes its mind and consults the British government for advice. Shell BP followed this guidance. Through the duration of the conflict, it remained Nigeria's silent ally. once advancing a royalty payment of £5.5 million to pay for further British armaments. On July 25, 1967, federal forces finally took control of the Bonny oil facility, and it wasn't until then that British Prime Minister Harold Wilson decided to support Nigeria with military assistance. Early in August 1967, following the federal victory at Bonny, Wilson called a conference at 10 Downing Street with David Hunt, the British High Commissioner to Nigeria, to get his appraisal of the situation. Wilson sided with Nigeria as a result of Hunt's belief that the federal forces were better organized and would prevail because they could mobilize a larger population. Britain secretly provided Nigeria with military intelligence, weaponry, and possibly even assistance in hiring mercenaries throughout the conflict. The BBC skewed its news in favor of Nigeria once it was decided to support them. The federal military government received 2 ships and 60 vehicles as supplies. On June 12, 1968, The Sun and ITV in Britain began covering the humanitarian campaign surrounding Biafra. With a lot of money at their disposal, the charities Oxfam and Save the Children Fund rapidly mobilized. France supported Biafra by giving it guns, mercenary warriors, and other aid while advocating for it globally and labeling the situation as a genocide. Biafra's just and noble cause was referred to by President Charles de Gaulle. France, however, opted not to diplomatically recognize Biafra. It appears that France had supplied 2 B-26s, Alouette helicopters, and pilots via Pierre lorries. As part of routine supplies to Côte d'Ivoire, France provided Biafra with confiscated German and Italian World War II weaponry that were sent without serial numbers. Additionally, France provided the federal government of Nigeria with Panhard armored vehicles. When seen in the perspective of its geopolitical strategy, Francafrique, and rivalry with the British in West Africa, French involvement in the war can be understood. Nigeria served as a hub for British influence in the region, which was primarily French-aligned. In particular, Côte d'Ivoire under President Félix Houphouët-Boigny was used by France and Portugal as a transit point for supplies bound for Biafra. In some ways, France also stuck with its former stance from the Congo crisis, supporting Katanga's separation as a mining province in the south. Oil drilling contracts for the Société Anonyme Française de Recherches et d'Exploitation de Pétrolières, SAFRAP, reportedly agreed with eastern Nigeria before to its secession from the Nigerian Federation, provided France with economic incentives. SAFRAP asserted ownership of 7% of Nigeria's petroleum supply. According to a CIA analyst's assessment from 1970, France really gave backing to a handful of Biafran capitalists in exchange for the oil. For its part, Biafra openly praised its partnership with France. On August 10, 1967, Ojukwu proposed that Biafra make French instruction in secondary, technical, and teacher training institutions mandatory in order to benefit from the rich culture of the French-speaking world. Internationally, France set the standard for Biafra's political backing. Portugal contributed armaments as well. The Biafran Historical Research Center in Paris orchestrated these transactions. In May 1968, the French-aligned nations of Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire recognized Biafra. De Gaulle personally gave 30,000 francs on May 8 to buy medicines for the French Red Cross expedition. Only briefly did fairly widespread student worker revolt divert the government's focus. Despite the government's declaration of an arms embargo, arms supplies to Biafra continued under the guise of humanitarian aid. The administration stepped up its attempts in July to engage the populace in a humanitarian response to the crisis. French newspapers and television programs were flooded with depictions of malnourished youngsters and allegations of genocide. On July 31, 1968, in the middle of this media frenzy, de Gaulle released an official pro-Biafra statement. The head of the French Foreign Intelligence Services, SDECE, African Activities, Maurice Robert, said in 2004 that his organization provided information on the conflict to the media and instructed him to refer to it as genocide in their reports. On March 11, 1969, France proclaimed Biafra Week, which was centered on a 2-franc raffle organized by the French Red Cross. De Gaulle immediately stopped the flow of weapons before stepping down on April 27, 1969. General Jacques Foccart, the principal coordinator of France's Africa policy, was removed by interim President Alain Poher. Foccart was rehired by Georges Pompidou, who also continued to support Biafra by working with the South African secret agency to smuggle more weaponry. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk stated that America is not in a position to take action as Nigeria is an area under British influence, when the U.S. officially declared itself neutral. The United States officially had no side in the Civil War. Despite strong public support for Biafra, its strategic interests aligned with those of the federal military government. The U.S. valued its alliance with Lagos and worked to safeguard private investments totaling $800 million, according to the State Department. Until now, efforts to relieve the Biafra people have been thwarted by the central government of Nigeria's desire to pursue total and unconditional victory and by the Igbo people's fear that surrender would result in widespread atrocities and genocide. This is according to Richard Nixon, a candidate for the presidency of the United States in 1968. But what is happening now is genocide, and starvation is the cruel reaper. Nixon discovered that, aside than requesting another round of peace negotiations, there wasn't much he could do to alter the status quo when he was elected president in 1969. He persisted in personally supporting Biafra in spite of this. Before the war, 9% of the oil leaving Nigeria was produced by Gulf Oil Nigeria, the third largest oil company in Nigeria. It continued to pay royalties to the federal government because all of its operations were offshore of the Midwestern Territory under federal jurisdiction, and most of its operations were unaffected. The Nigerian administration received substantial support from the Soviet Union, which highlighted the parallels to the Congo crisis. Gowon accepted a Soviet offer to sell a squadron of 17 MiG-17 fighters in the summer of 1967 due to Nigeria's need for additional aircraft and the refusal of Britain and the United States to sell any more aircraft to Nigeria. The Soviet Union was generally viewed with suspicion by the British-trained Nigerian military, but Alexander Romanov, the Soviet ambassador in Lagos, was a gregarious, amiable, and cunning diplomat who quickly built up a strong rapport with Gowon and persuaded him that accepting Soviet weapons did not imply submission to the Soviet Union. In August 1967, the first MiG-17 aircraft and 200 or more Soviet technicians arrived in Nigeria to educate the locals in their use. The Soviet-Nigerian armaments agreement proved to be one of the turning points of the conflict, despite the fact that the MiG-17s proved to be too advanced for the Nigerians to operate effectively and required Egyptian Air Force pilots to fly them. The possibility that the Soviet Union would exert more influence in Nigeria led Britain to increase its supply of arms in order to maintain its influence in Lagos while excluding the possibility that either the United States or Britain would recognize Biafra. This led to the establishment of an arms pipeline from the Soviet Union to Nigeria, with the diplomatic caveat that these were provided strictly for pay on a commercial basis. The Soviet Union regularly provided Nigeria with weaponry. The USSR agreed to fund the Kainji Dam on the Niger River in 1968, somewhat upriver from the delta, when it proved out that Britain was, in reality, supporting the federal government. Soviet media agencies were forced to retract their early accusations that Britain was cynically helping the Biafran breakaway. A mutual aversion to internal secessionist movements may have contributed to Soviet sympathies for the federal military government. The Soviets had a favorable impression of the Igbos prior to the war. with the diplomatic caveat that these were provided strictly for pay on a commercial basis. The Soviet Union regularly provided Nigeria with weaponry. The USSR agreed to fund the Kainji Dam on the Niger River in 1968, somewhat upriver from the delta, when it proved out that Britain was, in reality, supporting the federal government. Soviet media agencies were forced to retract their early accusations that Britain was cynically helping the Biafran breakaway. A mutual aversion to internal secessionist movements may have contributed to Soviet sympathies for the federal military government. The Soviets had a favorable impression of the Igbos prior to the war. To their dismay, however, Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin claimed that the Soviet people completely understand Nigeria's motivations and its necessity to prevent the country from being split in October 1967. According to reports, the conflict significantly enhanced diplomatic and commercial ties between the Soviet Union and Nigeria, and Moskvich automobiles started to arrive in Lagos. Cacao from Nigeria was competitively imported by the USSR, since the Soviet Union was one of Nigeria's most ardent allies and sent huge amounts of armaments. China, who had just established itself as the Soviet Union's adversary in the Sino-Soviet split, announced its support for Biafra. The People's Republic of China declared its full support for the justifiable struggle for the liberation of the Biafran people against the Nigerian government, which was backed by Anglo-American imperialism and Soviet revisionism, in its first significant statement on the war in September 1968, according to the New China Press Agency. Through Tanzania, China provided Biafra with armaments valued about $2 million between 1968 and 1969. Early on, Israel anticipated that Nigeria would play a significant role in West African politics and prioritized maintaining cordial ties with Lagos in its foreign policy. Based on potential common traditions, Israel and the Igbos also built a cultural relationship. Considering that the northern-dominated government has a Muslim leaning, these actions were a tremendous diplomatic achievement. Some northern authorities forbade Israelis from entering Maiduguri and Sokoto because they disapproved of relations with Israel. Israel didn't start selling weapons to Nigeria until Aguiyi Ironsi took office on January 17, 1966. It was thought that now was a good time to establish this connection with the federal government. In January, Ram Nirgad was appointed Israeli ambassador to Nigeria. In April, 30 tons of mortar rounds were delivered. In September 1966, Israel first received requests for aid from the eastern region. Despite possibly connecting the Biafran representatives with another arms dealer, Israel appears to have continually rejected their requests. According to the U.S. State Department, Israel started providing the federal military government with armaments in 1968 for a total cost of around $500,000. As in other places, the situation in Biafra was described as a genocide in the interim. On July 17 and 22, 1968, the Knesset held a public discussion on this subject that received praise from the media for its delicacy. Political organizations on the right and left, as well as student activists, voiced up for Biafra. 12 tons of food supplies were covertly delivered to a nearby location in August 1968 by the Israeli Air Force outside of Nigerian, Biafran, airspace. Through Zurich, Mossad secretly sent $100,000 and sought to send weapons to Biafra. Soon after, Israel made plans to use transport aircraft from Côte d'Ivoire to make covert weapons supplies to Biafra. Sub-Saharan African countries frequently voted in favor of UN resolutions proposed by Arab governments, showing their support for the Arab side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Given that the majority of African nations supported Nigeria, Israel was reluctant to offend them by explicitly backing Biafra. Weaning the African states away from the Arab states was one of Israel's main diplomatic objectives. In August 1967, President Gamal Abdel Nasser sent Egyptian Air Force pilots, flying the just-arriving MiG-17s, to fight for Nigeria. The Biafrans tried their best to publicize instances of Egyptian civilians murdered, so the Egyptian pilots' propensity to randomly bomb Biafran civilians backfired in the propaganda war. The East German pilots who were substituted for the Egyptian ones by the Nigerians in the spring of 1969 proved to be far more capable. Canada deployed 3 observers to Nigeria at the government's request to look into claims of genocide and war crimes against the military there. 2 additional Canadian officers joined Major General W.A. Milroy in 1968, and they remained with him until February 1970. Biafra unsuccessfully requested assistance from the Organization of African Unity, the precursor to the African Union. Many African nations, including Ethiopia and Egypt, supported the Nigerian government to avoid instigating uprisings in their own nations. The member states typically did not want to promote domestic secessionist movements. However, African nations like Tanzania, Zambia, Gabon, and Côte d'Ivoire supported Biafra. Biafra engaged foreign mercenaries for further support since they were outgunned by Nigeria's overwhelming firepower. Mercenaries who had previously fought in the Congo crisis were pulled to Biafra with great interest. The 4th Commando Brigade of the Biafran Armed Forces was given over to German mercenary Rolf Steiner, who oversaw 3,000 soldiers. One of Steiner's subordinates, the Welsh mercenary Taffy Williams, was in charge of 100 Biafran fighters. The other adventurers under Steiner's command included the Italian Giorgio Norbiato, the Rhodesian Johnny Erasmus, the explosives expert, Alexander, Alec, Gay, the Irishman Louis, Paddy, Mulrooney, the Corsican Armand Irinelli, who had joined the Foreign Legion by feigning Italian nationality, and a Jamaican bartender turned mercenary who went by the name of Johnny Korea. Pilot Jan Zumbach, a Polish Swiss, organized and led a haphazard air force for Biafra. The leaders of the Biafran air operations were the Canadian Lynn Garrison, the Swedish Carl Gustaf von Rosen, and the Rhodesian Jack Malik. They attacked Nigerian forces while simultaneously sending weaponry and food aid. Portuguese pilots transported weaponry from Portugal to Biafra while serving in the Biafran Air Force. By turning some Chris craft boats into gunboats, Steiner created a brown water fleet that was effective at launching surprise attacks for supplies and weaponry. It was anticipated that using mercenaries in Nigeria would have a similar effect to that in the Congo, but the mercenaries were mainly ineffectual because the Nigerian military received more superior and more sufficient training than the Congolese militias. Even though there were some early successes, such as Operation OAU, over half of the 4th Commando Brigade was wiped out by Nigerian forces during the disastrous Operation Hiroshima of the 15th to the 29th of November 1968. Which caused Steiner to experience depression and a nervous breakdown and ultimately led to his expulsion and Taffy Williams's replacement. Despite the fact that Nigeria seemed to be a more formidable foe, observers of the battle noticed that the remaining mercenaries seemed to have grown personally or ideologically committed to Biafra's cause, which is unusual for mercenaries. Belgian mercenary Mark Goossens was reportedly motivated by his hatred of the British government when he was slain by defensive Nigerian forces during Operation Hiroshima, which supported Nigeria during the war. The Igbo people were allegedly the victims of genocide, according to Steiner, who claimed to have fought for Biafra out of idealistic motivations. However, American journalist Ted Morgan mocked Steiner's claims, describing him as a militarist who simply craved war because killing was the only thing he knew how to do well. Taffy Williams is quoted by journalist Frederick Forsyth as saying, "I've seen a lot of Africans at war," in reference to his Biafran colleagues, "but nobody can actually touch these folks. For 6 months, give me 10,000 Biafrans, and we'll assemble an army that will be unbeatable on this continent." Men who would have received the Victoria Cross in another situation have died in this conflict, in my opinion. When asked about the effect of the mercenaries on the war by a journalist after the conflict, Philip Effiong, the head of the Biafran General Staff, responded, they had not assisted. Even if not one of them joined the secessionist troops, it would not have mattered. The longest staying was Rolf Steiner. More than anything else, he was a horrible influence. We were glad to rid ourselves of him. Following critical setbacks in Abagana, Arachukwu, Oguta, Umuahia, Operation OAU, One, Ikitek Pene, etc., Nigerian forces were unable to make significant gains into the remaining Biafran-controlled territories from 1968 onward. However, a second Nigerian onslaught, which went from April to June 1968, started to encircle the Biafran people with more gains on the two fronts in the north and the conquest of Port Harcourt on May 19, 1968. When it became clear that there was widespread malnutrition and hunger among civilians in the besieged Igbo districts, the blockade of the encircled Biafrans caused a humanitarian catastrophe. The Biafran leadership requested aid from the outside world after reporting that Nigeria was employing famine and genocide to win the war. Senator Ted Kennedy led private organizations in the U.S. to respond. These murders never had a perpetrator brought to justice. The Federal Army prepared for what Gowon referred to as the final offensive in September 1968. After some Nigerian forces were routed in Biafran ambushes, Biafran troops eventually neutralized the final onslaught by the end of the year. A southern federal military government offensive was successful in breaking through in the latter phases. However, in an effort to throw the Nigerians off balance, the Biafrans launched a number of offensives against them in 1969. Beginning in March when the 14th Division of the Biafran Army regained Owerri and advanced into Port Harcourt before coming to a standstill just north of the city. Biafran commandos retook control of Kwale's oil wells in May 1969. Biafran forces launched a significant land offensive in July 1969 with the assistance of foreign mercenary pilots who continued to fly in food, medicine, and munitions. The most renowned of the mercenaries was the Swedish Count Carl Gustaf von Rosen, who oversaw airstrikes using 5 Malmo MFI-9 Mini-Coin tiny piston-engined aircraft outfitted with machine guns and rocket pods. Von Rosen, Gunnar Haglund, and Martin Lang were the three Swedes who made up his Biafran Air Force. Biafran's Willie Murray Bruce and Augustus Opke made up the other two pilots. Von Rosen's small force attacked Nigerian military airfields in Port Harcourt, Enugu, Benin City, and Ogeli between May 22 and July 8, 1969. In the process, it destroyed or damaged several Nigerian Air Force aircraft used to attack relief flights, including a few MiG-17 fighters and 3 of the country's 6 Aleutian Il-28 bombers that were regularly used to bomb Biafran villages and farms. The Nigerians quickly bounced back despite the tactical success of the 1969 Biafran offensives. The Nigerian Air Force's combat activities were hampered by the Biafran air raids, albeit only for a brief period of time. The Biafran administration started employing foreign mercenaries to prolong the conflict in response to the Nigerian government deploying them to lead some gains. Only Welshman Major Taffy Williams and German-born Rolf Steiner, a lieutenant colonel with the 4th Commandos, would stay for the duration. Nigeria used Soviet MiG-17 and Il-28 bombers as its foreign aircraft. The September killings and Igbo exodus from northern Nigeria that followed served as the foundation for the first human rights petition to the UN to stop genocide and offered a historical connection to Biafran allegations of genocide during the Nigerian Civil War. The situation became more widely recognized in 1968. Information was mainly spread through religious networks, starting with missionary notifications. The fact that the Biafrans were Christians and the northern Nigerians in charge of the federal government were Muslims was not lost on international Christian organizations. Among these Christian initiatives were Joint Church Assistance and Caritas, the latter of which was affiliated with numerous international Catholic aid organizations. The blockade that the Nigerian government enforced on the eastern area in the months preceding secession was the cause of the famine. The main issue, according to Frederick Forsyth, a prominent novelist who was working as a journalist in Nigeria at the time, was kwashiorkor, a protein deficit. Prior to the American Civil War, local hogs, poultry, and eggs were added to imported dried fish from Norway as the primary source of dietary protein. The blockade blocked imports, which swiftly exhausted local protein supplies. The national diet was now almost entirely starch. The Biafran Airlift, which was organized by numerous volunteer organizations and sent food, medicine, and occasionally, according to certain claims, weaponry into Biafra, broke the blockade. It was increasingly frequently claimed that the weapons-carrying aircraft would closely follow aid aircraft, making it more challenging to tell them apart from military supply aircraft. The American community to keep Biafra alive distinguished itself from other groups by developing a comprehensive plan for exerting pressure on the American government to play a more active role in providing relief immediately. The American Committee was established in July 1968 by recently returned Nigerian Peace Corps alumni and college students. Strong friendships and their identification as Igbo led the Peace Corps volunteers stationed in the eastern region to want to assist the eastern region. Lynn Garrison, a former RCAF fighter pilot, was one of the people aiding Count Carl Gustav von Rosen. He showed the Count how to drop supplies in bags to far-flung Canadian locations without losing the contents. Before the supply drop, he demonstrated how one food bag might be placed inside of a bigger bag. The outer sack kept the contents intact while the inner sack ruptured when the package touched the ground. By using this technique, loads of food were dropped on countless Biafrans who would have otherwise starved to death. One of the French medical professionals who volunteered with the French Red Cross to work in hospitals and food facilities in besieged Biafra was Bernard Kouchner. The Red Cross forced volunteers to sign an agreement that was intended to guarantee the organization's neutrality under all circumstances but was perceived by others, like Kouchner and his allies, as being comparable to a gag order. This contract was signed by Kouchner and the other French physicians. The volunteers were attacked by the Nigerian army after entering the nation, along with Biafran medical personnel and hospitals, and they saw blockading forces starve and kill citizens. When he returned to France, Kouchner openly criticized the Nigerian government and the Red Cross for what he perceived to be their apparent collusion. Kouchner also witnessed these events, particularly the enormous number of starving children. Kouchner brought Biafra to the attention of the media and urged an international response to the problem with the assistance of other French medical professionals. These doctors, under the direction of Kouchner, came to the conclusion that a new assistance organization was required, one that would put the welfare of victims above political and religious distinctions. They created Médecins Sans Frontières, formerly known as the Comité de lutte contre le génocide in Biafra, in 1971. Doctors Without Borders. The crisis led to a significant rise in the visibility and funding of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Due to their impact on domestic morale and the dynamics of foreign involvement, the media and public relations played a crucial part in the war. Both sides placed a heavy reliance on outside assistance. To influence American public opinion, Biafra recruited the New York public relations agency Rudra and Finn. However, major foreign support was not gained until Biafra hired the Geneva public relations firm Mark Press in January 1968. William Bernhardt, an American public relations executive who managed Mark Press, received a monthly salary of 12,000 Swiss francs and anticipated receiving a portion of Biafra's oil profits after the war. Catholic opinion all around the world, notably in the United States, supported Marques's presentation of the conflict as a Catholic Igbos fight for freedom against the Muslim-dominated North. Marquess also claimed that the federal government was committing genocide against the Igbos, depicting the war as a fight between Christians and Muslims. This accusation was quite successful since images of famished Igbos helped to win over the world's sympathies. In the summer of 1968, global media efforts highlighting the hardship of the Biafrans became more intense. The famine and pogroms were characterized as genocide by the Biafran leadership and afterwards by people all over the world. Fictitious Igbo Judaic origins were exploited to support analogies with Jews in Germany. Igbo refugee camps were compared to Nazi concentration camps in the international press. Humanitarian appeals varied a little bit from location to another. Humanitarian aid in Britain made use of well-known imperial duty discourses, while adverts in Ireland drew on common Catholicism and Civil War memories. Both of these pleas used more traditional cultural norms to support the new multinational NGO paradigm. Because most of the Catholic priests operating in Biafra were Irish, the public there strongly identified with the country because they considered the Biafrans as fellow Catholics fighting for independence. The Irish war reporter John Hogan wrote, "The threat of famine combined with an independence struggle had an almost irresistible political and emotional impact on Irish public opinion, which became enormously supportive of the regular airlifts of food and medical supplies to the struggling infant republic via the offshore Portuguese island of São Tomé." The federal government's deliberate use of famine to starve Biafra into submission prompted comparisons to Ireland's Great Famine of the 1840s, and many Irish people perceived the Igbo people's battle for independence as being similar to their own. Pro-Biafra group Frederick Forsyth, a British journalist who began reporting the war for the BBC in the summer of 1967, quit in protest in September 1967 after growing frustrated with the British government's pro-Nigeria attitude. When Forsyth returned to journalism as a freelancer in 1968, he collaborated closely with the Irish Holy Ghost Fathers to gather data about the famine, and their dispatches from Biafra had a significant influence on British public opinion. The Holocaust parallel and the idea of a threat from aggressive Muslim neighbors were both promoted in Israel. The Biafran conflict introduced the idea of starving African children to Westerners. One of the first African tragedies to receive extensive media coverage was the Biafran famine, made possible by the widespread use of television. The televised tragedy and the growing number of NGOs benefited one another. NGOs kept up their own communications networks and had a big influence on how the story was covered. Biafran leaders deliberated the intentional release of precisely crafted public information after studying Western propaganda techniques. Biafran propagandists had to simultaneously uplift internal morale and nationalist sentiment while appealing to global public opinion. Simple explanations of the battle were best communicated through political cartoons. Push polling was another tactic employed by Biafra to imply that Nigeria is inherently bloodthirsty. Chinua Achebe, a writer of novels, devotedly propagandized for Biafra and became one of its most prominent worldwide supporters. A Columbia University student named Bruce Mayrick set himself on fire on May 29, 1969, outside the United Nations building in New York City to protest what he saw as the genocide of the Biafran people. The next day, he passed away from his injuries. John Lennon, a musician, returned the MBE he had received from Queen Elizabeth II in 1964 on November 25, 1969, in opposition to British assistance for Nigeria. Lennon said the following in a letter to the Queen returning the MBE. "Your Majesty, I am returning this to express my disapproval of Britain's engagement in the Nigeria-Biafra issue, our backing for the United States in Vietnam, and the decline in popularity of cold turkey. I love you. Lenin. John. 11 Saipem employees and agate technicians were slain in an oil field invasion by Biafran commandos in May 1969 in Kwale. They uninjuredly grabbed 3 Europeans, and they thereafter went to an Okpai field development nearby. 15 more foreign employees were surrounded and taken prisoner by Biafran forces. 14 Italians, 3 West Germans, and 1 Lebanese were among the detainees. The foreigners allegedly helped build roadways for Nigerians to use in their operations against Biafran troops and were captured fighting alongside Nigerians against Biafran forces. They were found guilty and given the death penalty by a Biafran court. This incident sparked outrage across the globe. The governments of Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America applied coordinated pressure to Biafra in the month that followed Pope Paul VI. Ojukwu pardoned the foreigners on June 4, 1969, after receiving a personal letter from the Pope. They departed Biafra after being released to the special envoys sent by the governments of Gabon and Ivory Coast. The 3rd Marine Commando Division led a strong drive on December 23 as the Nigerian Federal Forces started their final offensive against the Biafrans with enhanced British help. Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo, the division's commander, and a future 2-term president, was successful in dividing the Biafran enclave into 2 before the end of the year. On January 7, 1970, the 3rd Marine Commando Division began the final Nigerian onslaught, known as Operation Tailwind, with backing from the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions to the north and south. Owerri and Uli, 2 Biafran towns, were destroyed on January 9 and 11, respectively. Only a few days earlier, Ojukwu had taken off for Ivory Coast in exile by plane, putting his deputy Philip Effiong in charge of coordinating the Federal Army's surrender to General Yakubu Gowon on January 13, 1970. The Civil War came to a conclusion and secession was abandoned when the capitulation paper was signed on January 14, 1970, in Lagos. A few days later, the fighting came to a close as Nigerian forces made little headway against the remaining Biafran-held regions as they advanced. Gowon declared following the conflict, "Violence's awful chapter has now come to an end. The process of national reconciliation is just beginning. We have the chance to create a new nation once more. My dear fellow citizens, we owe respect to those who have died and to the heroes who have given the ultimate sacrifice so that we might create a country that is great in justice, fair commerce, and industry. The Igbos suffered severe losses due to the battle in terms of people, resources, and infrastructure. Up to 1 million people may have perished as a result of the fighting, the majority through hunger and sickness brought on by Nigerian soldiers. Famine that was purposefully enforced throughout the war by embargo claimed the lives of more than 500,000 people. Medicine shortages were also a factor. As the battle dragged on, thousands of people perished every day from starvation. In September 1968, the International Committee of the Red Cross estimated that 8,000 to 10,000 people per day died from famine. In 1968, the head of a delegation representing Nigeria at a peace conference declared that starvation is a legal weapon of war, and we have every intention of employing it against the rebels. Most people agree that this position reflects the Nigerian government's policy. Additional atrocities allegedly committed by the Federal Nigerian Army include rape, mass murder with machine guns, and deliberate bombardment of civilians. In 1966, ethnic minorities such as the Ibibio, Ijaw, Akwere, Ogoni, and others made up about 40% of the Biafran population. After sharing the same fate as Igbos in the north, ethnic minorities in Biafra initially had differing perspectives on the fight early on. They had the same apprehension and anxiety as Igbos. These beliefs were negatively impacted by the Biafra rulers' actions, which appeared to show that they supported the Igbo majority. Minority groups and Biafra opponents were treated with extreme suspicion, and combing operations were carried out to comb these groups for saboteurs, or Sabo, as they were known. Because it frequently resulted in death at the hands of Biafran forces or even crowds, this brand was greatly dreaded. A whole community was subjected to violence as a result of the claims, including massacres, rapes, kidnappings, and imprisonment in camps by Biafran soldiers. The Civil Defense Group formed the paramilitary Biafran Organization of Freedom Fighter, BOFF, with the goal of suppressing the enemy. The BOFF conducted combing operations throughout minority neighborhoods. In Biafra, all sides of the conflicts fighting committed crimes against the country's minorities. Eastern Nigerians were the target of indiscriminate pogroms in the north in 1966. Despite what appeared to be a natural alliance between these northern pogrom victims, tensions increased when it was believed that minorities were working with federal soldiers to sabotage Biafra. Minorities have always wanted their own state within the Nigerian Federation. The federal soldiers shared equal responsibility for this crime. Federal troops slaughtered hundreds of ethnic minorities that supported Biafra in the Rivers region. Approximately 2,000 Efiks were also slain by federal forces in Calabar. Both sides of the battle committed atrocities on the residents of Asaba in modern-day Delta State outside of Biafra. Academics including legal expert Herbert Ekwe asserted that the Biafran War was a genocide for which no one has been held guilty, while arguing that claims of genocide are inconsistent with the fact that the Igbo were not eliminated after the war ended and that Nigeria was fighting to maintain control of Biafra and its inhabitants rather than to expel or eliminate them. Critics of this position acknowledge that starvation policies were intentionally pursued and that responsibility for the 1966 pogroms has not been sought. The International Committee for the Investigation of Crimes of Genocide ruled that the measures taken by the Nigerian government against the Igbo constituted genocide after Biafra lodged a formal accusation of genocide against the Igbos. Jurist Emma Okocha referred specifically to the Asaba massacre when she called the killings the first black-on-black genocide. Ekwe holds the British government largely accountable for their backing of the Nigerian government, which, in his view, enabled for their atrocities against the Igbo to continue. The oil money aided in a quick reconstruction, but the old ethnic and religious divisions persisted in Nigerian politics. Authorities in Nigeria have been accused of using funds intended for reconstruction in the former Biafran areas for their own ethnic communities instead. For many years, a military administration presided over Nigeria, and residents of the oil-producing regions complained that they were not receiving a fair part of the country's oil profits. Political parties cannot be based on an ethnicity or a tribe, according to laws that were approved, but, in reality, this has been difficult to implement. The administration did not feel the need to reinstate Igbos who fled for their lives during the pogroms and the war, preferring to treat them as having resigned. When the conflict was finished, they found that their positions had been taken over. This justification was also applied to homes and properties owned by Igbo people. Any home owned by an Igbo was quickly occupied by people from other areas, notably in the Port Harcourt region. This was explained by the Nigerian government by calling such properties abandoned. But because the Nigerian government's policies were perceived as further economically crippling the Igbos even decades after the conflict, there has been a sense of unfairness as a result. Nigeria's decision to change its currency and stop honoring pre-war Biafran supplies of Nigerian money added to the sense of injustice. No matter how much money an Easterner had in the bank, just £20 was awarded to them after the end of the war. This was imposed regardless of whether they were banking in Biafran or pre-war Nigerian cash. This was perceived as an intentional strategy to restrict the growth of the Igbo middle class, leaving them with little money to pursue their commercial interests. President Olusegun Obasanjo commuted to retirement the discharge of all military personnel who supported the breakaway state of Biafra during the Nigerian Civil War, according to a report in The Guardian on May 29, 2000. He stated in a nationwide broadcast that the choice was made on the basis of the tenet that justice must always be tempered with mercy. Up until its resurgence by the modern movement for the actualization of the sovereign state of Biafra, Biafra had all but vanished off the face of the earth. There was a country. A personal history of Biafra, Chinua Achebe's most recent book, has also reignited conversation on the conflict. Nnamdi Kanu launched the Indigenous People of Biafra, IPOB, separatist organization in 2012. The violent Orlu crisis began in 2021 as a result of escalating tensions between IPOB and the Nigerian government, which led IPOB to declare the start of the Second Nigeria-Biafra War. The separatists declared that Biafra will prevail this time. A study from 2021 claims that women who experience the Biafran War have shorter adult statures, a higher risk of being overweight, first pregnancies at younger ages, and lower educational attainment. Mothers' exposure to war has a negative effect on the survival, development, and education of their offspring. Impacts change depending on exposure age.